Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government. You still think that jet fuel brought down the World Trade Center? Does anybody else see a problem here? If the government has nothing to hide, why are they so afraid to answer a few questions? This story does not add up.
Welcome to InfoWars Nightly News. This is Mike Adams, the Health Ranger, on this Friday, May 11th, 2012.
Tonight, more government crackdowns on family farms as the Minnesota Department of Agriculture unleashes threats against moms who help distribute fresh farm food. Then, a sober warning from the Japanese ambassador who says the fate of the world depends on reactor number 4. An update on the Fukushima cover-up. Plus, the Pentagon is researching narrative networks, a new technology to explore neurolinguistic engineering of cover stories. This will allow the government to calculate the most unbelievable cover story that the public will swallow. And finally, a bombshell interview with the co-founder of Natural Society, Anthony Gucciardi, in studio with Mike Adams as they discuss the evil of Monsanto and reveal secret documents never before seen until now.
All right, before we get to our top story tonight, which is on Fukushima, I want to remind you that there's a fantastic interview coming up later with Anthony Gucciardi from naturalsociety.com, who has breaking news about never-before-seen secret documents exposing the collusion between Monsanto and the USDA over genetically modified alfalfa crops. Now, to our top story. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power facility is in a precarious situation today, and at risk is the future of life as we know it in the Northern Hemisphere. That is not an exaggeration. In fact, U.S. Senator Ron Wyden visited the site in Japan, and he then issued a press release on his website talking about how precarious the situation was. Also, a former Japanese ambassador was there and issued a release talking about how the fate of the world depends on reactor number 4. Now, we covered this on Natural News. It's also been covered, of course, at Infowars.com. And in that story, we talked about how the cesium-137 radiation that could be emitted from reactor number 4 is extreme. And here's the quote from the former Japanese ambassador. Quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that the fate of the whole world depends on the number 4 reactor. And why is that the case? Because there are thousands of rods of fully spent and partially spent fuel rods. This is what, of course, powers the nuclear power plants, but they still contain radioactivity, lots of energy still contained in them, and they're in a pool that could be destroyed by an earthquake or a tsunami striking the Fukushima area. And that could happen at any time. Even a 7.0 to a 7.5 magnitude earthquake could take out that pool and cause this nuclear material to combust, to literally burn right into the open air, releasing a plume of radioactive elements, including cesium-137 and cesium-134, which would then drift into North America from about 6 days to 10 days, and then it could blanket much of the northern hemisphere thereafter. Now, if this could cause North America to become uninhabitable by humans, as you can see. This is a quote from a story that I wrote, I believe. Up to 85 times the radiation release from Chernobyl has been calculated. Now, what's interesting is today on the Alex Jones show earlier, we did have nuclear industry expert Arne Gundersen on, and we asked him about that figure 85 times, and we fact-checked it with him. He said he wasn't sure exactly where that was calculated, but he then did confirm that at least 20 to 30 times Chernobyl's radiation was contained in the nuclear fuel rods still being stored at the Fukushima Daiichi site. And if there is a fire, if there is an earthquake, if there is even a terrorist attack on that facility, it could unleash unprecedented levels of radiation across North America and around the northern hemisphere. So this is a massive risk, and most importantly, this is the big part. He said that even if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States made the funds available to try to rescue this situation, to contain those nuclear spent fuel rods, it would take them, in his words, 2 to 3 years to take care of that situation. So between now and 2 to 3 years out, and that's even if they decide to solve the situation, we are at risk of an imminent radioactive catastrophe, a nuclear apocalypse, if you will, if there's an earthquake that shatters that pool and causes that nuclear fuel to burn and be emitted into the air. The cover-up of this issue is being called Plumegate. So search for that on the search engines if you want to learn more about Plumegate. Moving on to our second story, the Pentagon is researching what they call narrative networks. This is a new spooky technology that would allow the Pentagon to build a linguistic weapon, you might call it. They would have a device, a computer, that could calculate what kind of cover story they could come up with that the public would buy and be comfortable with. So if they're planning, let's say, a false flag attack, if they're planning another imperialistic war attack on some innocent third world or developing nation, if they're planning perhaps gun confiscation in the United States or war on the American people even theoretically, they could come up with a cover story that most Americans would buy because it was calculated by this neurolinguistic programming computer. This is some scary stuff. I've never seen anything like this. When we think about weapons built by the government, we normally think of, things that explode, maybe nuclear weapons. We don't normally think about linguistic weapons, but that's exactly what this is. It's a kind of hijacking of the brain. It's kind of reverse engineering the way that we process language. And here is what the BBC says about this. It says that U.S. officials will have a device that could advise them what to say, generating a story based on a scientific understanding of the brain's inner workings to soothe tempers and calm the mood of the population. Isn't that exactly what they need? Stay calm, everybody. You're only being enslaved. You're only having your guns confiscated. You're only eating radioactive food and being vaccinated with chemical adjuvants that will eat your brain and lobotomize you. Stay calm, stay quiet, stay safe. That's the new American slogan. All right, moving on to our next story. This concerns the dangers of modern science. Now, for the record, I am not against science, not real science. In fact, I'm an advocate of science. I've been trained as a scientific thinker. In fact, I went to engineering school and I took courses in microbiology and anthropology and genetics, in fact. But I put out an urgent warning today on Natural News. It's called SOS, Stop Out of Control Science. And the website for that is just sos.naturalnews.com if you want to see the infographic. Now, let me explain why this matters. If you look at what is threatening us today across our planet, just look at the issues that we cover here at InfoWars, things that Alex covers on his show, that Kurt Nimmo covers on prisonplanet.com and Infowars.com. What do they all have in common? Well, think about it. It's GMOs threatening our crops, threatening our fertility. It's vaccines threatening our fertility, threatening our population. It's nanotechnology. It's advanced artificial intelligence. It's robot drones that the Pentagon has and vehicles that drive themselves now. This is a fact. A vehicle's been licensed in Nevada, been given a driver's license, and the driver is a robot. Seriously, that has happened. So what do all these things have in common? The drug-resistant antibacteria in hospitals, the super weeds, they all have in common science gone bad, dangerous science. So we must learn to distinguish the good science, which is what you see on your screen there, from the dangerous science. And that's what this infographic is all about. Good science is the quest for understanding and knowledge, and that's good. And that's good for humanity. We need that. But dangerous science is the quest for profit and power at the expense of humanity. Look at the next slide there, if you would, please. A lot more to cover here. This is called the precautionary principle, and this is what we need to get back to. If an action or a policy has a suspected risk of causing harm, the burden of proof that it is not harmful falls on those taking the action. In other words, scientists must prove their wild experiments are safe before unleashing them onto the world. That would mean that GMOs could only be experimented on in tight quarantine situations. You can't just spread those GMO seeds on a field and let the wind blow them around the world and cause self-replicating genetic pollution. Now, we have other information on this infographic. In fact, the next slide should be 5 levels of the dangers of science. I want to go into some detail on this for you so you truly understand how much danger we literally face today. Level 1 dangerous science is not so dangerous. It's just physical contamination. Soot from smokestacks, for example. It's just physical. It's not a chemical. It's not radioactive. No, not really such a big deal. It can be cleaned up. Imagine floating plastic in the Pacific Ocean. It's a physical contamination. We can deal with that. But level 2 dangerous science is chemical contamination. The example of this is Core Exit in the Gulf of Mexico, BP using that to clean up the oil spill there. It chemically reacts with biological systems and can cause great harm to human beings, animals, and plants. Now, the third level of dangerous science goes even further. This is radiological pollution, which can't be cleaned up like a chemical. It can't be neutralized like a chemical. Radioactive pollution continues on for decades or even centuries, depending on the isotope. And in the case of cesium-137, which would be released in very large quantities from Fukushima, the half-life of that element, that isotope, is 30 years, meaning that even 90 years or 120 years from now, we still have very high contamination levels of cesium-137 in our soils. So nuclear radiation is a very dangerous contaminant, and that's not even the worst, because we have level 4 science. This is where it gets really scary, because level 4 is self-replicating pollution, pollution that can multiply itself. Now imagine, remember the movie Terminator, where the Terminator robots were being built by a factory run by Terminator robots, controlled by a giant computer that gained awareness and decided to eliminate humankind. Well, that was science fiction, but today we have science fact in the realm of GMOs. For example, GMOs replicate, and you can never recall them and put them back in the box. It has escaped into the wild. It is self-replicating genetic pollution. Superbugs that escape from hospitals are in the exact same category. They replicate. You can go to a hospital, catch a superbug, an antibiotic-resistant strain of bacteria, take it home, and then it begins to replicate in your body there, and you could pass it on to somebody else. That was created as a result of the abuse of, quote, scientific antibiotic drugs, which were approved by the FDA under what they call scientific principles. We also have the issue of nanotechnology. Now, today, nanotech is not that dangerous, but what if scientists developed self-replicating nanotechnology robots? Microscopic critters, you might say, and we'll show an image of that later, but they could self-replicate and eat the environment at the same time. The globe could be covered with a nanotech self-replicating gray goo that could literally consume us all. That is science fact, or at least theoretical fact, that could be happening in the very near future.
I'll be back.